The studio lights were warm but the air felt tight, like something invisible was pulling everyone's breath shorter. Tyler Perry sat across from Michael Strahan with his hands folded, calm on the surface, eyes steady, voice measured. The conversation had started the way these things always do, with praise and laughter, with clips rolling on the screen and the audience applauding on cue. Tyler nodded politely, thanked the hosts, cracked a small joke that landed easily. For a few minutes it felt safe, familiar, rehearsed. But there was a subtle shift when the questions drifted away from celebration and toward commentary. A sentence landed heavier than expected, wrapped in a smile but edged with implication. Tyler paused, just long enough for the silence to feel noticeable. In that pause lived years of rooms like this, years of interviews where his work was framed through someone else's lens. He smiled once, not defensive, not angry, but thoughtful. When he spoke again, his voice was calm, almost gentle. He talked about intention, about building something from nothing, about what it costs to carry responsibility for stories that reach millions. The words were careful, but the meaning was clear. He was asking to be seen fully, not summarized. Michael leaned forward, nodding, trying to keep the energy light, but the momentum had shifted. The next question came quicker, sharper, less patient. It wasn't shouted. It didn't need to be. It suggested criticism without saying it outright, a familiar tactic that left little room to respond without seeming defensive. Tyler's eyes flicked briefly toward the audience, then back to Michael. A murmur rippled through the seats as people sensed something unfolding that hadn't been planned. Tyler adjusted in his chair and took a breath. He spoke about respect, about how narratives are shaped, about how often success invites dismissal instead of curiosity. He wasn't lecturing. He wasn't raising his voice. He was explaining, as if hoping clarity might soften the edges of the moment. Cameras zoomed in slightly, producers sensing tension that translated well on screen. The hosts smiled, but their smiles were tighter now, less natural. As Tyler continued, his words became more personal. He spoke about the early days, about rejection letters and empty theaters, about sleeping in his car while believing fiercely in stories no one else wanted to tell. The audience quieted, drawn in by the sincerity. This was not a sound bite. This was context. For a moment, it seemed like the room might settle into something real and meaningful. Then came the interruption. It was brief, almost reflexive, but it broke the rhythm. Michael interjected with a comment that reframed Tyler's point into something more palatable for daytime television. The shift was subtle, but Tyler felt it immediately. His shoulders straightened. The smile faded, not into anger, but into resolve. He nodded once, slowly, as if acknowledging something internally rather than responding outwardly. He stopped speaking mid-thought. The silence stretched longer this time. The kind of silence that makes people glance at monitors and earpieces. Tyler looked down at his hands, then back up, meeting Michael's eyes directly. When he spoke again, his tone had changed. It was firmer now, grounded, unmistakably final. He said that there are moments when conversation becomes performance, and that he had learned to recognize when his presence was being used rather than respected. A soft gasp came from somewhere in the audience. The hosts shifted in their seats. Someone off camera cleared their throat. Tyler thanked the crew, his voice steady, sincere, without sarcasm. He said he appreciated the platform, but that he knew when it was time to step away. There was no grand speech, no dramatic flourish. Just a decision spoken plainly. He stood up slowly, smoothing his jacket as he rose. The camera hesitated, unsure whether to follow him or stay on the hosts. For a split second, the entire set felt suspended, like the show itself had forgotten what came next. Tyler nodded once more, a quiet acknowledgement to the room, and turned toward the edge of the stage. The applause that followed was scattered and uncertain at first, then grew louder as people processed what they had just witnessed. It wasn't the applause of entertainment. It was the applause of recognition. Tyler walked with measured steps, not rushed, not theatrical. Each step felt deliberate, a boundary drawn without shouting. Behind him, Michael called his name, trying to soften the moment, to pull it back into something manageable. Tyler didn't turn around, not out of disrespect, but out of clarity. He had said what he needed to say. The cameras lingered on his empty chair, the space where he had been moments earlier now speaking louder than any words. As he disappeared behind the curtain, the studio buzzed with confusion and whispered commentary. Producers scrambled, hosts filled the air with improvised transitions, and viewers at home leaned closer to their screens. But Tyler was already beyond the lights, beyond the microphones, carrying with him the weight and relief of choosing himself in a room that hadn't expected him to. What remained on that stage was not just an awkward television moment, but a quiet reminder that not every story is meant to be contained, and not every voice will stay when it realizes it is no longer being truly heard. Backstage, the noise of the studio faded into a low hum, replaced by the muted shuffle of crew members pretending not to stare. Tyler Perry didn't rush or slam doors. He moved with the same steady calm he had carried on stage, the kind that comes from making a decision long before the moment demands it. A production assistant offered water. Tyler accepted it with a nod, took a sip, and thanked them. There was no anger in his face, only focus, as if he had just finished something necessary rather than dramatic. In a nearby control room, producers spoke over one another, replaying the moment in their heads and on their screens. They debated how it would look, how it would sound, how quickly the clip would spread once it hit social media. On set, Michael Strahan sat straighter than before, listening to instructions through his earpiece while keeping a professional smile fixed in place. He filled time with practiced ease, but the absence across from him was unmistakable. The empty chair had become the loudest presence in the room. Outside the studio, phones began to buzz. Assistants, agents, and publicists sent messages in rapid succession. Tyler's phone stayed in his pocket. He walked into his dressing room, closed the door gently, and sat down. For a moment, he simply breathed. The adrenaline drained slowly, replaced by a familiar quiet he had learned to trust. He had walked away from deals before, from rooms that demanded silence in exchange for comfort. This felt no different, just more public. Within minutes, clips surfaced online. Some captions screamed outrage, others praised composure. Comment sections filled faster than anyone could read them. Viewers debated who was right, who was wrong, who should have handled it differently. But beneath the noise, a consistent theme emerged. People recognized the moment not as a tantrum, but as a boundary. They saw someone choosing dignity over decorum. Michael watched one of the replays during a commercial break. From his angle, the exchange looked different than it had felt in real time. He replayed the interruption, the shift in Tyler's expression, the stillness before he stood. Regret flickered briefly across his face, quickly masked by professionalism. Live television didn't allow room for reflection, but it had a way of forcing it afterward. When the show wrapped, the hosts exchanged polite goodbyes and careful words. No one lingered too long. The energy had changed, and everyone felt it. In the hallway, Michael crossed paths with a producer who shook their head and said, "That wasn't supposed to happen." Michael nodded quietly. Some of the most important moments never are. Elsewhere in the building, Tyler finally checked his phone. Messages from friends and collaborators filled the screen. Some were supportive, some concerned, all aware that this moment would follow him for a while. Tyler replied to only one, a short message to a longtime friend. "I'm good," it read. And he meant it. By evening, headlines had multiplied, each framing the moment through a different lens. Some called it a walkout. Others called it a stand. Pundits dissected body language and tone, freezing frames and assigning meaning to every glance. Tyler watched none of it. He sat in his hotel room, looking out at the city lights, thinking about the young version of himself who had once begged for any platform that would listen. He remembered how silence had once felt like failure, how staying quiet seemed like the price of being invited back. Somewhere along the way, he had learned that being heard mattered more than being seen. That lesson had cost him opportunities, but it had given him something far more valuable: peace. The next morning, the story continued to ripple outward. Other artists shared their own experiences of interviews gone wrong, of moments when their words had been reshaped to fit someone else's narrative. The conversation shifted from one interview to a broader question about respect, about who controls stories and who pays the price when they are oversimplified. Michael released a brief statement later that day, careful and composed. He expressed respect for Tyler's work and acknowledged the intensity of live conversation. It was measured, professional, and sincere enough to quiet some critics while leaving room for interpretation. Tyler read it once and set the phone down. He didn't feel the need to respond. Not everything required a rebuttal. Days later, Tyler returned to work. Sets buzzed, scripts were revised, actors rehearsed. Life moved forward, as it always did. Yet the moment lingered, not as controversy, but as reference. People spoke about it in meetings, in classrooms, in quiet conversations about self-worth. It became shorthand for knowing when to stay and when to leave. In interviews that followed, Tyler addressed the moment only briefly. He said it wasn't about walking away from a person, but about walking toward himself. He spoke about the importance of recognizing when dialogue stops being dialogue. His words were calm, reflective, and free of bitterness. That, more than anything, surprised people. The chair on that stage was filled again the next day by another guest, another story, another smile. Television moved on. But for those who had watched closely, something had shifted. They had seen a moment where success did not demand silence, where composure did not mean compliance. Late one night, alone again, Tyler smiled to himself. Not because of the attention, not because of the debate, but because he had listened to the quiet voice inside that had guided him all along. In a world that often rewards endurance over honesty, he had chosen truth, even when it meant standing up and walking away.